For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jerry Ibarra. I am the writer of this independent horror film we call Leyenda. And the objective here tonight is to not only discuss my top five horror films, but also discuss the project. Before I move forward, I just do want to mention that Jason Dax will not be available to join us as a participant tonight, but he is instead going to be an observer. So he'll be seeing what we're doing here tonight. Just want to get that out of the way. And once again, why we're doing this is because we have an independent film project called Leyenda, which is a horror film. And we have a crowdfunding campaign page, for those of you who don't know, that we're trying to raise funds for. And we have, after tonight, we are down to our last 2 weeks. So we're currently at just under $2,400. And we do have a couple of goals. Right now, the minimum goal is to reach $5,000. So obviously, we're close to halfway there. Now, it would be really fantastic if by the end of this program, in the next few minutes or so, for those who haven't had a chance to look at the campaign page or to contribute, if you could participate and help us out with whatever contribution you can give, and any little bit helps, whether it's $5, $10, really goes a long way, because the more that people participate, the more that other people will be inclined to get involved as well. So I believe at the moment we have just over, or at 20 participants, contributors. And like I said, we just have under $2,400. So it would be really awesome if by the end of this program we could hit 3,000. That would be great. So once again, about our project Leyenda, this is an independent project that's been in development for some time now. And it's been a passion project of mine that I've been developing, revising, and putting together a pitch deck, attaching cast members, and so forth. And our other producer, Jason Dax, and myself, I'm really pushing this project now more so than ever, because we really obviously believe in it, but we see a lot of potential in it, and it's something original that we can contribute to the horror cinema. So definitely, please, if you haven't already done so, see the link that we have posted here. So all you have to do is click on it, and it'll take you to the campaign page, and there's tons of information there, from the synopsis to the storyboard. There's a 4-minute video of myself talking about the project in more in depth. And there's incentives as well, as far as what contributions you can give and what you can possibly get back for your contribution. Now, we're going to be discussing, since it's just myself tonight, my top 5 horror films. Now, I grew up in the 80s, so I am going to be a bit biased on my selection here, just letting you know off the bat. These films that I'm primarily choosing for my top 5 are films from the 70s and 80s. But at the same time, I've kept up with some of the more recent horror films and some of the classics prior to the 70s as well. So before I give my top 5 list, I just want to give honorable mention to films like The Omen, John Carpenter's Halloween movies, The Fog, The Thing, also Wes Craven's These Hills Have Eyes, as well as Nightmare on Elm Street, Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead, and some of the classics such as The Shining, Night of the Living Dead, and Psycho. And I also want to mention, before I go to my top 5 list now, another honorable mention of mine is a film that I think is really underrated, a great horror film, Amityville Horror Part 2, The Possession. This is a film that was released in the early 80s. Not too many people have seen it. It didn't do so well at the box office. It kind of just went quietly away. But this is a film that's really well made. The only critique I have of this movie, as good as it is that it does tend to rip off The Exorcist quite a bit at times. Other than that, excellent horror film. Last thing I want to mention as well is that whether or not you may have seen these films that I'm going to mention, there are going to be spoilers. Okay, I'm not going to go too in depth into the film, but if you haven't seen it, just be aware of that now. That I'm going to mention some of the highlights of the film and the conclusions and things of that nature. So there are spoilers. Okay, and the other thing I want to mention too is that these films that I put on my list are all American films. Okay, no foreign films, except for one film that's on my list. That's actually a co-production that was done in the U.S. and in the U.K. And that brings us to our first film on my list, which is at number 5, which, like I said just now, was a co-production with the U.S. and the United Kingdom, and that is An American Werewolf in London, which was released in 1981, and is actually a horror comedy directed by the great comedic director John Landis. Now, in my opinion, best werewolf movie ever made, and still is to date. There's some terrifying angles, point of views, sound effects are horrifying, and you can't go without mentioning, of course, the incredible, amazing work that was done by the special effects makeup artist Rick Baker, whose transformation sequence still holds up to this day. And there's no CGI here, none of that crap. This is one of the best werewolf transformations, if not still the best, I've ever seen depicted in a film. and I still have nightmares about this creature. It's so well made. It's something original and different. It's not. They went away from the typical Wolfman approach to an actual wolf, a huge, scary, beastly-looking wolf that's just terrifying. And the direction, like I said, it's superb. The way it was shot, the cinematography, I mean, really, really frightening. So now I will move on to another film, which is number 4 on my list, that is also very underrated. Again, not too many people have seen this film, and it was released in 1983, the supernatural thriller called The Entity, which was directed by Sidney J. Furie. Now, The Entity stars Barbara Hershey and Ron Silver, and it's supposedly based on true events. It's a chilling story about a single mother who is constantly being raped by an unholy spirit. How horrifying is that? To be visited and molested nightly by something you can't see or stop. I mean, it's really, really frightening movie. Now, she eventually teams up with paranormal investigators. They come to her aid, but unfortunately, it doesn't quite end there. Very well-made film. It's got a deafening score, very impactful, and it's deeply involving, which is rare for some of these horror films. You really feel for this woman. This is by no means a cliche character, but a real person with real emotions. And it's not only a horrific story, but it's a very touching story, and you really have that rooting interest for this main character. And it's, like I said, just terrifying. Very underrated. I will now discuss my number 3 on my list. And that would be a film that was released in 1976, also a supernatural thriller, directed by the great Brian De Palma. And this would be Carrie, which is actually Stephen King's first published novel. Now, word to the wise, if you don't know this already, never bully the social outcast because she or he may turn out to have telekinetic powers. Okay? The film is brilliantly directed with slow motion sequences and some Hitchcock elements that just add to the suspense greatly. Excellent film. To this day, Carrie's blood-soaked face and bulging eyes remain one of the most terrifying images I've ever seen on film. Not to mention the psycho-evangelist mother of hers that's just relentless with her approach. It's a great horror film. Obviously, it's a famous film. There's been remakes. And one thing I want to also mention, some of these films I've named here, there's been some remakes. Don't bother with those. Don't waste your time with those. The originals are always the best, and they're all classics, in my opinion. But yes, Carrie would definitely be at my number 3 list. Growing up watching that film, like I said, was terrifying. Seeing Sissy Spacek transform herself into this evil telekinetic person just was really frightening. And there's some great sequences there. And again, it was directed by one of the top filmmakers we've ever had in Brian De Palma. So great horror film all around. Okay, we are now down to our last 2 horror films on my list. Now, before there was Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, or Friday the 13th, there was this film, which I consider to be the king of all slasher films. And that is, at my number 2, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was released in 1974, and it was directed by Tobe Hooper. If you don't know already, it's about a secluded family of cannibals that are killing and torturing a group of young fans passing through the town of Texas. It's raw, it has a documentary style to it, and it gives it just that right edge that makes it seem almost like you're watching something real, like it's really happening. What makes it so disturbing and frightening, in my opinion, and why it's number 2 on my list, and it's different from all the other ones I've listed so far or mentioned, it's because it's a film that, it's a story that can actually happen. And unfortunately, as we've seen over the years with certain serial killers, things like this have happened. In this case, it's a family of cannibals, right, doing awful things to people, but it's not about the supernatural, or anything, or some hideous monster that's not plausible, right? But this is something that actually could happen, and to some degree, unfortunately, like I said, has happened.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
So that makes number 2 on my list. And finally, if you haven't guessed it already, my number 1 film, as far as horror goes, of all time, clearly, without a doubt, it was released in 1973, directed by William Friedkin, is The Exorcist.
Are you comfortable, Reagan?
Now, that is the mother of all demonic possession films. Hands down, still the greatest horror film, in my opinion, of all time. I don't care what today's generation says. William Friedkin, coming off an Oscar win for The French Connection, where he won Best Director and the picture won Best Picture as well. He follows that up with this masterpiece. I can tell you, as a child, hearing that little girl's voice would sometimes not only bring me to tears, but give me nightmares all week long. I could not even see or hear anything to do with that film. That just scared the hell out of me. I understand my parents, when they were still dating, went to see it in the theater, and they always told me that when they would cut away from the sequences where they would show Reagan being possessed and so forth, that you could hear the audience gasping, like they were holding their breath the whole time that they were showing Reagan being possessed. And as soon as they would cut away to something more subtle and calm, people could breathe again. That's how scared they were. People were passing out, walking out of the theater, throwing up, having seizures, so on and so on. I've yet to see or hear of any other film that has provoked and caused that type of impact on audiences anywhere at any time. So this film, which was released in 1973, was way ahead of its time. It's the first of its kind. And not only, besides that, it's a mystery, it's suspenseful. Obviously, it's got horrifying imagery and great sound effects and shocking moments. It's also a really great, well-crafted story from beginning to end, crammed with clues and subtle hints, and some not so subtle.
Excellent day for an exorcism.
It's still the most iconic and shocking film I think ever made when it comes to horror. And if you take a poll with horror fans, I'm sure pretty much the majority, if not all, they'll still rank it as the #1 horror film of all time. And that concludes my top 5. Those would be it. So once again, to recap, at number 5, I've listed An American Werewolf in London. At number 4, The Entity. Number 3, Carrie. Number 2, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And of course, number 1, The Exorcist. All the originals. Once again, none of these remakes. Okay, all the originals. And if you haven't yet watched any of these, I definitely recommend that you do. This will conclude our program for tonight. I really appreciate those of you who were able to attend, and I hope you check out our campaign and help us out. Thank you all again, and have a good night.